Well, here it is, the biggest video I have ever done, so sit back, relax, and strap in, because this will indeed be a long one. This video has very much been a labor of love. The last video I did covering the factions of Warhammer Fantasy / Total War Warhammer got a ton of love and hype. So I figured, now that Immortal Empires is coming out for Total War Warhammer 3, let's keep this train going. So today we're going to cover an absolute truckload of factions for Warhammer Fantasy. And a lot of the factions we're going to go through today are a ton of fan favorites. Certainly my favorite factions are included in the video today. So I'm super excited to go through those with you. And if you haven't watched any other videos in this series, don't worry about it. I'm going to link them all at the end of this video. And very briefly, Warhammer Fantasy is a dark fantasy world based very roughly on the geography of the real life world. And aside from some broad cultural similarities, it's a pretty fantastical landscape. And from this setting, there is a tabletop miniatures game. In fact, there's a new one coming out called The Old World. There is a video game called Total War Warhammer. Now we're on the 3rd iteration of that. And at the time of recording, Immortal Empires is coming out for that, which will create the entire world of Warhammer in its game borders. So you'll be able to play as basically any faction ever, so you're gonna wanna watch this. And finally, there is also a tabletop role-playing game called Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, done by Cubicle 7. And if you don't know anything about Warhammer Fantasy, don't worry. I'm gonna tell you everything you need to know today. So join me, as today we focus on the people and places of the Old World, aka Fantasy Europe. So let's do this. So first up, we're gonna have the Empire of Man. And that's a pretty arrogant title, considering that there are other empires and they also consist of humans, aka men. So yeah, I guess they just claim that title. They are the beating heart of the Old World and very much the largest socio-political organization there. In terms of aesthetic, style, and culture, they're kind of roughly based around the Holy Roman Empire. And they are 100% my favorite faction. I love these guys. I used to collect an army of them for Warhammer Fantasy, the old miniatures war game. And I'm gonna be honest, every single opportunity I have in Total War Warhammer, I play as them. I buy the new faction DLC, and then I start up a new campaign as Karl Franz, the Emperor of Man. And I'm super stoked to be able to play them in Total War Warhammer 3. And honestly, if you have interacted with Warhammer in any capacity, you have probably bumped into these guys. They are very much the sort of default faction in a lot of ways. So the Empire itself is really vast and multifaceted, and partly this is because the Empire is often the focus of Warhammer media. And seriously, this video could be like 6 hours long, just on the Empire, and we would be missing stuff. So in the interest of my health and your attention span, let's go over it a little bit more briefly than that. So the Empire is the largest human-centric faction in the entire world of Warhammer Fantasy, although describing it as a faction is a little bit misleading. It's more like a pseudo-coalition of different states. And each of these states is ruled over by a noble known as an Elector Count. And these Elector Counts answer only to the Emperor. And they are called Elector Counts because they elect the next Emperor, usually when the previous one died, usually because of the actions of an Elector Count. And of course, this is Warhammer, so everything has to be a little bit bigger, a little bit more fantastical, and the mark of an Elector Count is the Runefang. These are ancient dwarf smith magical weapons that were created in the very first days of the Empire, during the time of the very first Emperor. This first Emperor was Sigmar Heldenhammer, and he has since become a god. He's been totally deified and now he's worshipped throughout the Empire. You might have heard of him. He is the great god Sigmar. Now, despite this, Sigmar isn't the only god that is worshipped throughout the Empire. There are a bunch of different gods, and probably one of the most contentious is the wolf god Ulrich. And actually in the northern states of the Empire, Ulrich is like the main god. And that has caused a lot of problems historically in the Empire, because down south they mostly worship Sigmar. And a recurring theme in Warhammer Fantasy is the further north you go, the more troubles you end up dealing with. And the northern states of the Empire tend to be perceived of as more barbaric by the more cosmopolitan south states. But if you ask any individual state of the empire who has it hardest, they will inevitably say that they do. Warhammer Fantasy is just a hard place to live, basically. So let's run through briefly every single state in the Empire. So in no particular order, the provinces are, you've got the Reichland led by Karl Franz. This is the seat of the Empire and of Altdorf, the capital of the Empire. Reichland is a, quote, big deal. Then you have Ostland, which is led by Valmir von Rukov. This is the northernmost province of the Empire. It is constantly at war. People who live here tend to be pretty tough. You have Hochland, led by Aldebrand Ludendorff. This is basically Diet Ostland. Famously, the Hochland long rifles originate from here. There is Talbigland, led by Helmut Feuerbach. This place has lots and lots of forests, some better than others. There's Wissenland, which is led by Emanuel von Leibowitz. This place is often referred to as the Armory of the Empire. It contains the city of Nuln. And Nuln is the largest, most industrialized city in the entire world. It has a ton of workshops and factories, and they are famous for their black powder weapons. Oh yeah, boys, we got ourselves cannons and guns. Also famously, Elspeth von Draken lives here as well. She's one of the most powerful amnestist wizards in all of the world, aka Death Wizard. There is the Nordland, led by Theodric Gosser. This is a very Viking-inspired province, and they are constantly battling the Norskins. There is Middenland, led by Boris Todbringer, who's probably one of the most famous Empire characters, second only to Karl Franz. And the Middenland is the big northern province that often rivals the Reichland. They're also the seat of worship for Ulrich. They're one of those provinces we were talking about before in terms of sectarian violence, shall we say. There is Ostermark, led by Wolfram Hetwig. This is a frontier province surrounded by vampires, greenskins, and basically Russians. There is Averland, which is currently contested actually, and it guards the main highway into Greenskin territory, aka Orc territory. There is Stirland, led by Albrecht Hausen. These names. Albrecht Hausen. This province absorbed the territory of Sylvania into it, which means that now it is absolutely chock full of vampires. Whoops! And there is also the Mutland, which is full of halflings. So you know, you're gonna want to avoid this place unless you want to get halfling fever, aka stench foot. Seriously, the halflings are a really interesting race. We're not really going to go through them today. They are a sort of minor part of the Empire, but they have their own little society here, and they are treated pretty poorly by their neighbors. But seriously, if you want to live anywhere in the Warhammer world, it's probably going to be the Mutland. Drink beer, eat food, relax all day, and they have the greatest holiday in the entire world of Warhammer, Pie Week. What's not the love? And there is also Marienburg, which technically isn't actually part of the Empire. It's kind of a long story, but it's a good one. Marienburg itself is basically Amsterdam. Almost all of the trade that pours into the Empire goes through the port of Marienburg. And years ago, there was a sort of political crisis. The Elector Count of the Westerland, who actually owned Marienburg, died without an heir, and this caused a huge political problem in the Empire. The famous Emperor Magnus did not know who to appoint. There was brewings of a civil war. Every family basically wanted to own Marienburg because Marienburg is one of the most fabulously wealthy cities in all of the Empire. And rather than appoint any one noble family as owning Marienburg and causing potentially that civil war, he instead elected to put the ruling merchant families of Marienburg itself in charge, which was kind of novel. This meant that no particular noble family felt slighted. And then years later, the Emperor Dieter raised the taxes on sausages and beer. The entire empire revolted and Marienburg declared its independence. And subsequent emperors, including Karl Franz, refused to acknowledge the independence of Marienburg, but they can't really do anything about it. The place is just too wealthy, it's got too much money, and a pretty big standing army of mercenaries. So there's a ton of different provinces, and they actually change throughout time. In Total War Warhammer, for example, there is the old province of Solent, which has been basically sort of reborn and led by the High Patriarch of Magic in all of the Empire, Balthasar Gelt. And so really, what Sigmar managed to achieve in uniting all of these people under the banner of the Empire of Man was really impressive and relatively temporary. In fact, Sigmar should be more famed for his diplomacy, really. He even forged an alliance with the Dwarfs, which is no easy feat when we get around to them. You'll see about that. Now, in the sort of contemporary time period of Warhammer Fantasy, the current emperor is Karl Franz. And he is known as a heroic and noble figure, although, fun fact, in the very first edition of Warhammer Fantasy, he was just some throwaway, kind of corrupt noble. It wasn't until the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy that he became the sort of griffin-riding hero that we all know and love today. And famously, he wields Gal Miraz, which is the proverbial Warhammer of Warhammer Fantasy. This is a magical weapon that was gifted to Sigmar himself by the Dwarfs. And despite the pomp and circumstance, I would say that the most gifted strength of Karl Franz is his statesmanship. It is not easy to keep the quarreling and bickering elector counts from turning on one another. Civil war is not unknown in the Empire. And indeed, a large part of the conflicts for the Empire in many different Warhammer Fantasy media is political conflict. There are often political issues that need to be resolved. The Empire itself is a living, breathing place, and all of its constituent parts slot together in a kind of messy way, but one that feels very real. And by far, it is the most fleshed out part of the setting. It isn't even close. And so for that reason, it's easy to see why there was a ton of fans of the Empire who were kind of upset that it all just went whoosh with Age of Sigmar. I mean, you go from this fully realized fantasy world into what is ostensibly the setting of a MOBA. So moving away from the politics side of things and instead to the battlefield, it's really hard to pin down what exactly the Empire's thing is. Really, if it's anything at all, it's versatility. This is true for the lore, for the fluff, as well as for the tabletop game and for the video games. The Empire has always been a flexible series of moving parts that work well together. Honestly, they can pretty much do anything you want them to do. They have infantry, they have cavalry, they have bows, they have firearms. They have indeed learned the secrets of black powder. And they have invented some incredibly impressive artillery pieces. Famously, the Hellstorm rocket batter. It's one of my favorites. Something fun about just launching rockets at your opponent. Speaking of which, famously, the Empire has command of what are known as steam tanks. Yes, steam tanks. They have tanks, and they are as intimidating, as frightening as you can imagine. Various states of the Empire also specialize in different types of combat. So for example, you have the Karabberg Greatswords, or the Nordland Seahawks, or the Nuln Ironsides, one of my favorites. And they are very toolboxy army. They basically have a tool for every single problem that is presented. It's just that they're not going to necessarily have the best solution to those problems. And they just don't really excel in anything. And in terms of magic, there is the famous Colleges of Magic. This is currently led by Balthasar Gelt, as we mentioned before. He is the Supreme Patriarch. And he is what's known as a Gold Wizard. There are lots of different schools of magic, depending on the winds of magic. And humans are not able to harness magic as well as, say, the High Elves are. Originally, humans were taught magic by the High Elves, but where High Elves can master every single school of magic, humans are too short-lived for that, so they can mostly master a single one. There has never been a human who has been able to master more than one school of magic. And all this is to say that the Empire, just because they're the human faction, doesn't make them mundane. They still have a ton of magic, they still have a ton of fantastical elements to them. For another example, there's also the Demigryph Knights, who are their elite shock cavalry, and these are knights that ride atop Demigryphs, these monsters. And of course, that's not to mention the warrior priests as well, which are holy warriors who are infused with the power of Sigmar. And they have the power to inspire troops, as well as heal them, and also deal a ton of holy damage with their big old warhammers. In summation then, the Empire is famously comprised of faith, steel, and gunpowder. That's just the way old discourse likes them. That's the geography, politics, and battlefield for the Empire. But there is, of course, the peasantry. The working Joe, the man on the street or in the field. And what would it like to be one of those people in the world of Warhammer Fantasy? Not great. And for one, there's an absurd tax on sausage and beer. But also, Warhammer Fantasy is a dark fantasy, and it's clear that the writers of the setting were trying to depict a time that consisted of a lot of dirt, a lot of toil, a lot of suffering, and early death. But on top of all that sort of real world problems, there's also a ton of issues that are specific to the world of Warhammer. There is the corruption of chaos. We haven't even touched on the work of the witch hunters, who go from village to village, interrogating and torturing those who are perceived as being perhaps touched by chaos. They like to operate by the motto of better safe than sorry, and the world itself is pretty actively hostile to life. If you walk into a forest that contains wood elves and beastmen, you are likely not ever wandering out. All the while, you are likely toiling in the dirt for phantom conflicts taking place in far-off places that you will never yourself witness, hopefully. And I think one of the things that surmises life in the Empire the best are if you go and you look at the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game and you look at the professions available to play in that game. Sure, you can be a wizard or a fighter, those classic fantasy classes, but really, the vast majority of potential professions in that game, they're things like grave robber or rat catcher or simply just peasant. And this is represented in the role-playing game as giving you a random chance to find out what profession you have. You roll a D100 and you see what you get. And that's us. We've just touched upon the very surface of the Empire. Like I said before, we could literally spend hours and hours and hours, but we gotta move on. So if you do want to ever see a big deep dive of the Empire on this channel, just let me know in the comments below. And next up, we have the Dwarfs. That's with an F, not a V-E-S. I'm watching you, token. So dwarfs are many things. They are an old race. They are skilled, sturdy, honorable, but without a doubt, the thing that comes to mind for most people when they think dwarves are grudge. Not like the movie, but the concept of holding a grudge. Because despite the fact that the dwarves have created many wonders, indeed, it is said that they have tunnels that span the entire world. They have created incredible underground kingdoms and mountain holdfasts, and they are master engineers. It is still the fact that the thing that people remember most about dwarves is that they are vengeful and stubborn. It is well known across the entire world to never get on the wrong side of a dwarf. So with that said, let's go through the gods of the dwarfs. There are 3 ancestor gods. You've got Grimnir, the god of battle. You've got Valea, the god of home, healing, and brewing, of course, appropriately. And you have Grugni, the god of mining and smithing. And really, that says it all about dwarven society. Now, importantly, these gods aren't worshipped the way that other races would worship their gods. Rather, they're seen as examples to live by. A dwarf warrior might model themselves on Grimnir, for example, aim to be as honorable and fearless as they are. And in terms of society, dwarves judge one another based on many factors: how rich they are, how skillful they are, but most importantly, how old they are. Dwarves can live for hundreds of years, their beards growing the entire time. Young dwarves are often called beardlings and older dwarves are called greybeards. Fun fact, that is also the same terminology used to describe people who've been in gaming circles for long enough. Now, dwarves take great pride in their beards. It's one of the most important things to them. It's where they place their sense of honor. So what happens when they lose it? Well, one of the unique parts of dwarves that is one of my favorite aspects of them actually, is that they never lose their sense of shame. So if you imagine the most shameful thing you have ever done in your entire life, it doesn't hit as hard now as maybe it did like right when you did it. Not true for a dwarf. They don't just lie awake at night remembering all the things that brought them the most shame the way that humans do. They spend the rest of their lives in that moment, feeling the exact intensity of shame as the day the event occurred. And for many dwarfs, this is unbearable. Especially considering that in dwarven society, your word is everything. A dwarf would sooner die than break an oath. Indeed, they have a specific word for the term oathbreaker. It's known as an umbaraki, and it is one of the worst insults that could ever be levied. And if a dwarf finds themselves in this position, the shame of that leads them to what can only be described as an act of eventual suicide. In such instances, they shave off their beard, they shave their hair into a mohawk, and they take the oath of the Slayer. And this is an oath to seek out great battles, great monsters to slay, until they are killed in battle. And from that day forward, there is nothing else that matters to them except for their righteous death. It is the only font by which they can remove themselves from the shame that they feel, to mitigate it in some way. That and drinking themselves comatose, hence the god of brewing. A good example of the Slayer is Umgrim Ironfist, aka the Slayer King of Carrick Cadron. One thing to note about him is that he has a very long beard. The reason for this is that he shaved it off a really long time ago. Seems like no matter how hard he tries, he just can't die. And not like he's invincible, he's just fucking nuts. Just nothing can seem to kill him. He keeps trying, and he just keeps killing things that he goes up against. He's kind of a badass. Now, there are many different kingdoms of dwarves with many different kings, but without a doubt there is one famous king who stands up above all others. It is the current High King of the Dwarves, Thorgrim Grudgebearer. This title is both symbolic and literal, as Thorgrim does carry the Damas Crown, which is a huge book that contains all of the historical grudges ever born against the dwarven peoples. It is also written in the blood of high kings. Perhaps the most famous examples of grudges written in that book are those against the High Elven King, Calador II. A king who famously started the War of the Beard, which was a war between the High Elves and the Dwarfs, because King Calador II shaved the beard of some dwarven ambassadors, and then dared the High King Guthric Starbreaker to come and get the shavings. He did. So those grudges still sit in the book, but it should be noted that both Guthric and Calador II are long dead. This happened eons ago. Yet, the grudge remains. It takes a lot to strike a grudge out of the book. And right now, Thorgrim is too busy battling against the orcs over the ancient dwarf homeland to really settle the score against the High Elves. But the book remains and the grudges inside, and so long as those grudges continue to exist, the Greybeards will grumble about it. But back in their day, they would never have let a grudge stand for so long. But it must be remembered that for the dwarves, overall, they are a dying race, as much as they do have tunnels that span the entire world, as they have great halls. Many of those are empty, or have been taken over by orcs and greenskins, or by the Skaven, the ancestral enemies of the dwarves. Many of the dwarf holds have fallen. There just aren't enough dwarves anymore. They have been whittled down by the world. But there is still some small amount of hope. There are still attempts to reclaim some of the ancient holds. For example, Belagor Ironhammer has a quest to reclaim Carrick 8 Peaks from Skarsnik, the hated goblin, who is a filthy little creature and who leads the night goblins, who we'll probably touch on a bit later. Now, in terms of the battlefield, dwarfs are basically the same all over. They're a brick wall. They don't move very fast, and even their archers, who are known as quarrelers, by the way, which is a little bit of wordplay that I've always loved, they're very heavily armored as well. And they're pretty notable for being able to stand up to cavalry charges, to something not every faction in the game can say. A regular dwarf warrior can basically withstand a lot more punishment than any man. But without a doubt, the peak dwarf concept of infantry are the Ironbreakers. These dwarfs are basically more armor than dwarf at this stage, and they serve as the counterpoint to the opposite end of the spectrum, who are the completely unarmored Slayers that we talked about earlier. Slayers, of course, being just whirling axes, the guy. Dwarves also shine in making things explode, so they do have a ton of artillery as well. In fact, their artillery is probably unmatched by any other faction, except for maybe the Skaven and, at a push, humanity. Their organ guns and cannons can shoot enemies completely apart, and their Iron Drakes are heavily armored flamethrower troops, which is totally fucking badass. Though it must be said, the dwarfs discovered gunpowder millennia ago, way before humans. In fact, they were the ones who introduced gunpowder to the humans, but the humans have got a lot more variety of artillery and they've pushed the concept further. And the reason for this is that dwarven technology moves very slow. As a species, they are incredibly cautious, perhaps too much so. And in fact, despite having gunpowder for millennia, many dwarfs still perceive gunpowder as a bit newfangled. Back in their old dad's day, they wouldn't have resorted to this sort of tomfoolery. Didn't need no guns when we broke Calidor. Nevertheless, they do have some maneuverability on the battlefield as a result of their technological prowess. Maybe slow, but dwarf technology is very dependable. And for that reason, they have the gyrocopter. These are flying machines, and they can perform strafing runs on their enemies, so that's pretty badass. Another little twist to dwarfs as well is their relationship with magic, or lack thereof, really. Dwarfs don't really do magic. In fact, they're pretty resistant to it. In Warhammer Fantasy Battles, they had a special mechanic, which meant that they were harder to impact with magic. They had magical resistance. But as a result of that, they also can't become wizards. They can't practice the art of magic. They can't harness the winds of magic. Now, to compensate for that, they can inscribe magical runes into their armor, into their equipment, into their weapons, even into their buildings. But nevertheless, other factions can do things like call down magical meteors, and dwarves will just never be able to do that. It's always been much more subtle. Still, nevertheless, though you might be able to outrun a dwarf, you'll probably never be able to overpower one, or outgun them. And next we have Chaos Dwarves. In order to explain Chaos Dwarves, or Dawi Azar as they call themselves, it's important to remember all of the information I told you about dwarfs and then reverse it. They're like an evil mirror version of dwarfs. Just imagine them all with evil mustaches. Sort of, they still have beards, they're still dwarfs. But they are steeped in magic and worship. And neither of those are particularly wholesome. As their name suggests, they are deeply embroiled in the ruinous powers. And it's sort of understandable how they'd end up this way too. So in the past, whenever the ancient dwarfs were first digging all the tunnels for the first time, some of them decided to strike out east towards the Mountain of Morn. And then they found themselves completely cut off from the rest of the underways by the ruinous powers, by chaos. And in this grim and inhospitable place, the very magics of chaos itself warped them. And it twisted them, both mentally and physically. And so, in their desperation, they turned to the fire god Hashut. And he became their, quote, father of darkness. Which is, you know, not exactly the nicest god in the world. Still not the worst though, in fairness. And so, the areas that the Dawi Zar came to occupy soon became filled with forges, factories. They became barren with blasted earth and flowing lava. Or to put it simply, metal as fuck. And within this kingdom lies Azar Nagrund, a massive black tower of smog and ruinous energy. Now, in terms of politics, the Chaos Dwarves operate in a system that you might term a theocratic magocracy. That is to say, the most influential and powerful among them are priests of Hashut, who are also known as the Demon Smiths. Yeah. They use incredibly sophisticated smithing and engineering techniques, much like their classic dwarf brethren. However, they also happen to incorporate my favorite material in all of the world, the very powerful and incredibly unstable warpstone. This material is basically magic radiation. It's a ton of fun. It can have all sorts of deleterious effects. The oldest demonsmiths in Chaos Dwarf society earn the title of Sorcerer Prophet, and the oldest of these priests of Hashut is Astragoth Ironhand. And despite his incredible power, his sobriquet belies the horrible curse that awaits all demonsmiths. For all of them will one day petrify and turn to stone. This starts with the extremities and works its way up the body. Indeed, Zarnagrand is lined with statues of what were once demonsmiths. Astragoth himself has compensated for this petrification by lopping off the bits of flesh that were turning to stone and replacing them with metal. Hence the fact he has a machine hand. Unpleasant, temporary, f***ing metal. But also Chaos Dwarves can also control powerful magics as well. And they use this to infuse metallic forms with demonic energies. And this can go from just infusing weapons or to the even more extreme. Chaos Dwarves can create demons of molten metal and steel. They are known as the Fireborn. The most famous of these is probably the Hell Cannon, which is literally just a demon inside a massive evil cannon that fires eldritch energies that are like homing beacons into their opponent. Yeah, how about that? Another thing they employ is a tremendous amount of slavery. Greenskin slaves are plentiful in Chaos Dwarf lands, both goblin, hobgoblin, and orc alike. In fact, the Chaos Dwarves, in some hideous ritual, created a being known as a Black Orc. This was an attempt to create a stronger, more reasonable, more subservient orc creature. The fact that Black Orcs can now be found across the entire world, often leading war bands of regular Greenskins, speaks to how successful that endeavor was. Warhammer obviously pulls inspiration from a lot of different places, but it's hard not to see Barad-dûr and the Uruk-hai here quite vividly. And likely you've seen similar things before, like the Dark Iron Dwarves in Warcraft, who were probably more than likely cribbed from Chaos Dwarves. Fun fact, if you do want to have some Chaos Dwarf miniatures, then Mantic Games do a pretty awesome Abyssal Dwarfs. You can pretty much use them as Chaos Dwarves. And in battle, the Chaos Dwarves are a dark reflection of their cousins. They have extremely heavy armor and extreme offensive firepower. One big difference though is that the Chaos Dwarves do have access to some maneuverability. They have access to the Bull Centaurs. These are massive, half-dwarf, half-bull creatures that some Chaos Dwarves have mutated into. Rough week for those guys, I'm sure. As well as this, there is of course the Fireborn, like the Hell Cannon mentioned earlier. There's also Chaos Giants and hideous winged beasts, the Great Tauros. Overall, their armies are considerably more arcane than regular dwarfs. But nevertheless, their lessons in discipline, in drill, in firepower were not forgotten. So as much as there isn't a lot of Chaos Dwarfs around, they are pretty tough. They are a very intimidating foe, and I hope that when they're introduced in Immortal Empires that they reflect this fact. So, too long didn't read, Chaos Dwarves are f***ing badass. They are genuinely just a metal album made flesh, and then turn slowly to stone, unless they're so badass that they replace those bits of them with machinery. And now we come to fair Bretonnia. Bretonnia is many things. It is a beautiful country, a land full of honorable and chivalric knights. It is a place of honor, nobility, and pretty awful toil. This place is the Warhammer equivalent of France and is a pretty awful place to live if you're not a noble or knight. And indeed, it is the exploits and actions of nobles that Bretonnia is famed for. It is said that the Knights of Bretonnia are the greatest in the world, and though the Empire Knights may grumble about that, it's more than likely true. This is partially down to the culture and history of Bretonnia, but also the fact that many of the knights in Bretonnia are literally divinely inspired and imbued. Especially those knights that are known as the Grail Knights, not the band. And if you're hearing the term Grail Knight and you're thinking, gee, that sounds familiar, you're right. Bretonnia as a faction has been totally inspired by Arthurian legend. I mean, get this, the main religion of Bretonnia is worship of the Lady of the Lake. Yeah, it's a watery tart who chucks swords at you. But it is said that the Lady of the Lake bestows power upon those who seek her grace, on those who display chivalry, on those who she deems worthy. And of course, this has been inspired by the story of King Arthur and the nymph that bestowed him the sword Excalibur. So why was the movie about him pulling it out from a rock? What sword did he pull out from a rock? But he was cutting through armor like it was nothing. Okay, whatever. Now, in the case of the Lady of the Lake, she is perceived to be the embodiment of the land Bretonnia itself. And for knights to find her and to receive her favor, they have to set out on this grand epic quest. They face challenges to prove their piety, their heroism, their honor, and if they prove themselves worthy, she anoints them with the Grail, which gives them divine powers. One thing to note about Bretonnia is that they are a massively segregated society when it comes to knights and gender. Only men are allowed to become knights. However, there are a lot of famous women who have pretended to be men in order to become knights. And one famous example of a knight who is a woman who does not pretend is Rapunzel de Leon. She is basically Joan of Arc. In fact, there are so many women who have pretended to be men in order to be anointed as knights in Bretonnian history that I suspect that it might be a bit of a monstrous regiment situation over there. Now, in terms of location, if you're trying to situate this place in your mind, Bretonnia lies to the west of the Empire, and it occupies a lot of fertile ground. And while Bretonnia is smaller than the Empire, it almost rivals it in agricultural output. The reason for that we'll get to in a minute. And as for relationship between Bretonnia and Empire as neighbors, it can be a little bit frosty. At some times in their history, they are stalwart allies, and at other times, they are bitter enemies. And Marienburg, if you remember those sausage lovers, they lie between the states of the Empire and Bretonnia. And there are many Bretonnian lords who would like to see Marienburg become a Duchy of Bretonnia. Marienburg is such a rich port that, well, everybody wants a little piece of that pie. But in all of history, Bretonnia has never managed to conquer Marienburg. And while both Bretonnia and the Empire are content to snap at each other with words and engage in a little bit of light raiding and looting across the borders, an all-out war between those two factions would be an absolute disaster for the stability of the old world. Now, when we talked about the Empire, we touched on the banality of peasantry and the brutality of feudalism. And for everything I said about the Empire, it goes like double, triple, quadruple for Bretonnia. Hence that economic output. While in the Empire, peasants toil in the fields and lords have almost absolute autonomy to do whatever they want, in Bretonnia, peasants are more like indentured servants. And the knights and lords of Bretonnia have absolute supremacy. To give you a bit of an idea of this, the nobles of Bretonnia often claims that the peasants that live within their lands have it no worse than anywhere else. After all, it's the watchful gaze of chivalry that defends them. But in law, it is illegal for a Bretonnian peasant to learn how to read. Additionally, they are not allowed to leave the areas that they have been allocated to farm. And as a result, there can be a lack of, shall we say, genetic diversity in their offspring. Let's just say they don't put step in front of brother. And in response to this circumstance, you actually do get peasants who rise up against their lords. In fact, there are bands of Robin Hood-esque bandits known as Arymos. And these bandits inflict violence upon the nobles of Bretonnia, and many of them are led by these terrifying individuals known as the Faceless. The bravery of these individuals cannot be overstated because the actual punishment for revolt in Bretonnia is the death of you, so you'll be tortured and killed, but also the torture and kill of your entire family. Bretonnian lords like to practice a little art form known as collective punishment. It's important, I think, when talking about Bretonnia to understand what the term noble and chivalry really means. It's kind of something that happens to the nobles. The peasant class are not included in that. And certainly, nobles are not selfless. They may be born to rule, but nobody said that they had to do it well. Speaking of which, at the other end of the ladder, from the faceless and peasantry, you have the dizzying height of the supreme ruler of all of Bretonnia, the one known as the Royarch, essentially the king. Similar to the Empire, the original Royarch was someone who managed to unite the disparate peoples of Bretonnia under the rule of his one kingdom. And the current Royarch is Luan Leoncaire, the Lion-Hearted, a particularly curiously ageless man. He resides in the capital of Bretonnia, Corogne, and when he goes to battle, he rides a massive hippogriff he has named Bique. And to be honest, in battle, he seems almost impervious to injury. So there's something going on there. And of course, Luan himself is a Grail Knight, and he was actually specifically chosen by the Lady of the Lake to lead Bretonnia itself. A little bit of a divine right of kings thing going on here.
Well, I didn't vote for you.
And to this end, she gifted him with a number of knights known as the Sons of Bretonnia. These are magically gifted knights that she created by stealing them away as children and then returning them years later. Pretty normal times. By the by, Llewellyn himself would rule Bretonnia for many years until he does meet his death in the end times, unfortunately. He actually dies to the hands of a chaos champion known as Festus the Leech Lord. However, for Bretonnia itself, not all was lost, even at the death of their beloved king. Another famous character in Bretonnia is known as the Green Knight of Green Knight fame. He is a mysterious knight who genuinely can never die. He had rules like that in Warhammer Fantasy, the miniatures game. And he emerges from greenery, shows up, helps save the day, kills a bunch of the enemy, and then disappears off again. It is said that in Bretonnia's greatest time of need, the Green Knight shows up. Or in 500-point skirmish games where both players have agreed to the use of special characters. And he is very interesting. He's a mythical character who is real. He has shown up at various times in Bretonnia's history, indeed when Bretonnia needed him most. Additionally, questing knights who are seeking the favor of the Lady of the Lake are also said to run into him quite often, and he beats them into submission. The identity of the Green Knight is shrouded in mystery. There was often a lot of speculation as to who it could be or whether or not it was just some manifestation of the Lady of the Lake, and in the end times it was revealed to be Giles the Breton, the original founder of the Kingdom of Bretonnia. And after the death of Llewellyn Leoncoeur, he goes on to lead Bretonnia throughout the end times. On the battlefield, the military of Bretonnia is as divided as it is societally. There is a very strict demarcation between the peasants and the not peasants. So peasant levies are plentiful. They are designed to clog up the enemy. You get a ton of them. They are typically pretty weak. Their morale is often quite low, and they are very poorly armed. The man-at-arms, the classic Bretonnian infantryman, is a foot slogger designed to basically soak up firepower from the enemy. Really, their job is to die. They don't get a lot of training, they get handed a spear, though the archers of Bretonnia, the longbowmen, are pretty fearsome. They actually came with spikes that they could put in the ground that would deflect against cavalry charges, which was quite interesting. However, in terms of lords and nobles, they ride horses, because of course they do. And Bretonnia's knightly cavalry are second to none. One of the really fun aspects of Bretonnia is the fact that every single knight has their own suit of arms, their own colors, which means that when you got a huge horde of knightly cavalry charging, they were bedecked with various colors and different orders and symbols and images. They do not wear a uniform. And the Grail Knights, of course, are the best of these. And more specifically, the Royal Pegasus and Hippogriff Knights, who bear the royal insignia of the king, dominate the skies. Oh yeah, we got knights not of just horses, but Pegasi and Hippogriffs. Bretonnia has a fucking air force. And for some reason, they decided not to use the bow, but to use the lance and literally lose the one advantage that being in the sky would grant you. It doesn't have to be sensible, right? They're knights. They don't want to use a bow and arrow. That's a peasant weapon. Let's be honest, it is pretty fucking badass to charge from the sky. Aside from those, you also get the Grail Guardians. These are a rare number of Grail Knights who have been chosen specifically to guard the Lady of the Lake's representatives in the world, the Fey Enchantresses. Fey Enchantresses, by the way, are women who have been chosen by the Lady of the Lake and who are imbued with her magic. Many Fey Enchantresses are served by what are known as damsels, who are also magically imbued as well, just to a smaller extent. And between those two, Bretonnia does have access to a lot of magic. It's very similar to the Empire, so they're versatile, but they also lose out to some of the more magically inclined races like the High Elves. And now we come to the Vampire Counts. Mwah, mwah, mwah. I'm sorry, I think I'm like contractually obligated to say it that way. Vampire counts are really interesting. I once bought an army of them from a crackhead who needed drugs. Ostensibly, they live within a very small section of the Empire. They, in theory, are quite minor. But to explain how they got there, I think we have to talk about Nagash. So once, long ago, in an ancient city, definitely a good ghost story now, there was a great necromancer who created a powerful elixir to defeat death itself. and he was successful. Now, after him came a queen, Queen Neferata, who sought to replicate his work, and she too was successful, though to a lesser extent, a more flawed extent. And it was from her that the curse of vampirism first sprung. She was indeed the first vampire and is known as the mother of vampires. But if she was the mother, then the great necromancer Nagash was the father. And he wasn't exactly pleased with the existence of vampires. And in fact, he attempted to enslave all of the vampires by tempting them with the promise of true invulnerability. The vampires managed to escape his clutches and fled that ancient city, and many of them found themselves within the old world, specifically an eastern province of the empire, the damned land of Sylvania. And the ancient vampires who fled the clutches of Nagash are still around today, but now they are outnumbered by their younger children. Younger vampires, who they have created using what is known as the blood kiss. Now, there are various different bloodlines of vampires formed from 5 different families. And they are as follows. Firstly, you have the Vashanesh, or to give them their more contemporary name, the von Karsteins. The famous Vlad von Karstein gave rise to the von Karstein bloodline, and they are often seen as the sort of default vampire family. This is mostly due to their numbers and also their focus in the old vampire counts battle tomes. They exert power over animals and are mostly based on the Dracula, the classic tropes of Dracula. Also, by the by, that control over animals also includes humans. You also have the Blood Dragon bloodline, which, yes, is an absolutely incredibly f***ing badass name. This bloodline was founded by Abarash, the personal bodyguard to Queen Neferata, one of the greatest warriors of that ancient city, Nehekera. Blood dragons are brutal vampiric knights, and they are terrifying. Some of them actually stick to knightly codes of conduct and vows. Abarash himself actually swore himself to Giles the Breton after facing him and being defeated in battle. So they're not all bad, although definitely they are terrifying and you should look out, they're gonna eat you. Next up we have the Lamian bloodline. This was created by Queen Neferata herself. These are known as the most devious and cunning of the bloodlines, and they can generally be found in positions of comfort and authority throughout the entire world. The Lamian bloodline are all said to be spies of Queen Neferata herself, who resides in the Silver Pinnacle. There she plots her return to the ancient city of Neherkara, and to do so she has infiltrated almost every single political court in the entire world. Anywhere you go, you will probably find a Lamian vampire. Or rather, they will find you if you're important enough to be found. And as vampires, they actually pass as human the most easily. This family is almost all entirely female. There is also the Nakark, the Nakark bloodline. Nakark. It's kind of a fun word to say. This was created by Wisorian. This was Neferati's priest and teacher, and it is the most magically inclined bloodline of them all. This magical power, however, comes with a price. Wisorian himself decided not to feed on blood. You know, he's gonna be one of the cool kids, one of the cool vampires, not gonna feed on blood. Instead, he attempted to preserve himself on the power of necromantic energies. And as a result, all of those descended from his bloodline bear the guise of hideous corpses. They are the ones who look the most vampiric-like, the most like bodies. Although, not to be outdone, we come now to the final vampire bloodline, which are known as the Strigoi. This bloodline sprung from Ushoran, the Queen Neferati's youngest brother. Against his sister's wishes, Ushoran actually partook in the vampire elixir, much to her annoyance, and actually she ended up despising him for it. And this resulted in a feral and mutated vampire bloodline. The Strigoi are scattered to the dark places of the world. They are monstrous and cannot hide themselves, and as a result they are brutally hunted down by vampire hunters, by mortals. So that's the history, but to tell the story of the contemporary vampire counts, we're mostly concerned with the von Karstein bloodline and how they came to the imperial lands of Sylvania. It was a dark and stormy night. Otto von Drac, colloquially known as the Mad Count, lay dying in Castle Drakenhof, his seat of power in the cursed land of Sylvania. He cursed the gods themselves for not leaving him with a male heir. His legacy could not continue on, but he was a cruel and unjust lord, fond of torturing peasants and popping their heads on spikes. Indeed, even the nobles of Sylvania itself did not heed his commands. His authority was weak and he was not well loved. Sylvania seethed with strife. It was an ill time for the lands and unrest was high. And as he lay dying on his deathbed, his legacy fading before his eyes, he declared that he would rather his daughter, the beautiful Isabella, marry a demon rather than his hated brother Leopold inherit. And would you know it, fate obeyed. As the dark walls of Drakenhof were lashed with rain, a lone individual rode into the court. And upon sight of this figure, the priest of Sigmar who was tending to von Drac fainted, passed away. And this mysterious figure was none other than Vlad von Karstein, a noble from, quote, far away. And he was here to marry Isabella and inherit the lands of Sylvania. Isabella herself, it must be said, fell for him immediately. And though von Drac was notoriously a bit of a hard ass, really, he found himself agreeing to this bequeathment. And that very night, they were married. Isabella married Vlad von Karstein, and with it, Vlad inherited the titles of the soon passing away von Draken. The marriage was performed, and Vlad von Karstein, for his part, passed his very first decree that Leopold, the uncle of Isabella, be thrown from the highest tower of the castle. And yes, we know, Vlad von Karstein was a vampire, and soon enough Isabella was too. But Vlad wasn't content with just the lands of Sylvania. Like any self-respecting elector count, he had his eyes on a larger prize. Rulership of the Empire of Man itself. Not content to be a vampire count, he wanted to be a vampire emperor. And so he did what any self-respecting elector count would opt to do in such a scenario. He waged a civil war. Not the first, and not the last in the Empire's history. And it should be said that his subjects actually really liked Vlad. Following the chaos and horrors of the von Drac rulership, Vlad von Karstein actually cared a little bit for his people, or at least cared for good governance. He inspired loyalty in his troops. And it seemed that he himself was immortal, that he could not be killed. Even if there were stories from his servants that said he never took food and would never wander the castles during the day. It really does say something about Sylvania when the best ruler that they've ever had was a bloodthirsty monster. In a very literal sense. And in his war against the Reichland and many other provinces of the Empire, he came very close to succeeding. In fact, he besieged Altdorf itself, and it was only through the betrayal of his kin, Manfred von Karstein, that he became undone. You see, Vlad had originally been gifted a ring of immortality by the great necromancer of Nagash, that's the whole thing. And this protected him from the armaments of his enemies. This information was leaked to the Empire, and the great master thief Felix stole the ring from Vlad. And this allowed him to be killed by none other than the Grand Theologianist of the Empire, the head of the Sigmarite Church. And it is said that Isabella herself became possessed by demons and despair upon the death of her lover. Now, Manfred von Karstein himself eventually went on to inherit the lands of Sylvania, and he is the contemporary ruler of Sylvania itself. And he is a powerful lord, but not just in strength of arms. He is a manipulative political figure. And he's also incredibly savvy when it comes to magic. He's very powerful with magic. Part of this is down to the fact that he plundered many Nehekaran tombs looking for the secrets of necromancy as left by Nagash. And as a result of its troublesome nature, shall we say, Sylvania is no longer recognized by the Empire as its own separate province. That means that it no longer has an elector count, formally. Manfred von Karstein might recognize himself in that capacity, but it doesn't make it so. Indeed, the lands of Sylvania itself have been folded into the ownership of Ostermark. which is a little bit of a mixed blessing. In reality, Slovenia itself is still firmly ruled by Manfred von Karstein. The land itself is hostile to travelers, the dead rise, and vampires in that area claim the blood tax. A tax which gives new meaning to the whole, oh, the nobles are bleeding me dry. It's not currency, it's not gold that they pay. They do give their blood to vampires in Slovenia. All peasants are expected to do so. But that's not to say that life for Slovenian peasants is much different than anywhere else. They still work, they still toil, and in fact, many of them are happy with their vampire overlords. I for one welcome them. That said, Slovenia itself, in the very ground, even before the coming of Vlad von Karstein, Slovenia has been cursed. Necromancers in the ancient past used to work there, and there is often warp storms that occur, which deposit large amounts of warp stone into the area. This is, again, magical radiation. Imagine the opening sequence of Smallville, over and over again. And the magic that comes from this stone has radiated throughout the soil, throughout the land, and it has made the dead lie a little bit restless. Which means that if you happen to be in the vampire business of raising the dead, your work isn't so hard. In fact, this might have been one of the things that attracted Vlad to the area in the first place. And indeed, the restless undead comprise of most of the armies of the vampire counts when they do march. But you're not just dealing with skeletons and zombies here, which they do have in pretty big numbers. In fact, to face the vampire counts on the field of battle is to face mostly legions of faceless undead. These worthless corpses often serving to simply bog down the enemy. But the vampires also employ various undead animals. You have feral wolves and bats and even these mutated monstrous vampires known as the Vargeists and Vargulfs. These are hideous monsters that can consume men in a single bite. And the vampire counts don't lack in cavalry either. There is the Blood Knights that we mentioned before. These are some of the greatest knights in all of the old world. They may be vampires, but all that does is make them stronger and more frightening. In fact, Blood Knights rival even Bretonnian knights in terms of power. And of course, there are the vampires themselves. The von Karstein family aren't the only ones that reside within Slovenia, even if they are the strongest, but they have large broods of vampires. And each one of them is worth a battalion of mortal men. They fight with supernatural speed and cunning. And many of them have several lifetimes worth of magical ability and capacity. Of course, these vampires are the linchpin of the vampire count forces. Because they raise the dead to form the bulk of their armies, that means if they die and their magical energy is ended, then their entire army can collapse. The mindless dead will fall easily by the wayside. Interestingly as well, you can often tell when a vampire army is on the march because there are dark clouds that will come with it, as they have to manipulate the sky in order to prevent the sun from burning them to ash. One telltale sign as well is that of the infamous Black Coach. The vampire count armies are pretty cool, to be honest. I'm a really big fan of them and the gothic horror that they imbue. And they're slotted neatly and tightly into the political framework of the Empire. There have been many successive vampire wars, and Slovenia is always making itself feel felt throughout history. It's hard to speak of the Empire without mentioning or acknowledging Slovenia itself and the vampire problem that often plagues the Empire. But there's not just vampire counts in Slovenia, there are vampire counts spread across the old world. Even Bretonnia has Musalon, a section of their kingdom that is controlled by a vampire. This is the famous Red Duke. So don't be fooled, vampires are a problem, they need to be dealt with, and there are some people out there who plan to make that so, but maybe we'll talk about them in a different video. And now we come to the dogs of war, mostly those coming from Estalia and Tilia. So up to this point, we have discussed a lot of different factions, peoples, armies, races, whatever you want to call them. Many ways of living and fighting. And most of them have believed in something. Either the bull god Hashut or the glory of Sigmar. Well, the dogs of war are no different, except the thing that they believe in is money.
We've got to have money.
To them, money is everything. And that makes sense. They are mercenaries, a ragtag group of mercenaries. And owing only their allegiance to money and being mercenaries, it makes sense that they are comprised of various different races, various different ethnicities, various different peoples from throughout the entire world. You've got ogres, dwarfs, giants, even, I shudder to say it, halflings. And if there is one specific place that the people of the old world think of when they hear the term mercenaries, it is, without a doubt, Tilia. Tilia is a direct parallel to Italy and Rome, down to basically being a Pig Latin translation of it. In fact, Tilia has an ancient empire in its past known as Remus. So yeah. Remus itself, by the way, is still a very fabulously wealthy city in Tilia. And the reason for some of their ancient success was that they traded and learned from the High Elves, a mystical race of elves who were many times more advanced than the humans. Now these days, Tilia is home to a lot of merchants and tradesmen, and much like the real world, specifically Venice and the Italian city-states, these rich merchants often clash with one another, and that gives rise to mercenaries. Now in terms of the setting of Warhammer, in terms of the games, Tilia itself hasn't really been touched on too much. In fact, Tilia are one of the older additions to the setting, and really a lot of the writings that we do have on them stems from the older style of Games Workshop writing. Back in the early days of Warhammer, the writings for these factions were a little bit more comical. They had a little bit more parody to them, a lot more tongue-in-cheek. So to give you a bit of an idea, there is a famous Tilian inventor known as Leonardo di Miraglio. Or there is the great Tilian explorer, Marco Colombo. In fact, Colombo is said to have discovered the New World. And actually, this gave Tilia a bit of a head start in that new continent. Tilia has a bunch of colonies spread throughout the New World. And the city that Colombo hails from, Trantio, is a major hub between the New World and the Old. So no doubt there is a lot of growing that this faction will probably do. And similarly, a lot of the names of units and characters for the Dogs of War are similarly a bit silly. But nevertheless, the Dogs of War are a very interesting army. In fact, you used to be able to take some of their mercenary units into other factions. So if you're playing as the Empire, for example, you could take some Dogs of War units. But as an army of themselves, Dogs of War tend to come with a backbone of kind of standard Tilian troops, armed with the signature long pike, and to be honest, they take anybody who is just looking for a good meal and a bit of payment. And actually, arguably the most important unit to the Dogs of War as an army is the Paymaster. This is the person who is responsible for pulling up the vast wealth required to hire to maintain a Dogs of War mercenary army. And the Paymaster divvies out that wealth to the units, maintaining morale. In fact, they often bring their chest with them as a visual reminder to the mercenary forces to remind them of what they fight for. And because almost anything and anyone can be convinced to fight for money, the Dogs of War have access to units called the Regiments of Renown. These are stranger bands of kind of legendary characters and regiments and forces, and they can comprise of very different units. So for example, you might get Druids or Lizard Men. And while I called the Empire Army pretty toolboxy, that they had a tool for every single problem, and the Dogs of War, while they might not have a tool for every situation, they can certainly buy one when needed. Plus, they have these guys. And a quick note on Estalia. Tilia and Estalia are often conflated as the same place, but in reality, they are bitter rivals to one another. Estalia is essentially fantasy Spain, and they also have a presence in the New World as well. They also provide a lot of units for the Dogs of War. The Estalians are a very proud people. They have a ton of merchants as well. They are a very rich country, and it is often said in the Empire that if you confuse an Estalian for a Tilian, they will draw swords. Of course, this doesn't exactly stop the ignorance of Empire soldiers. And Estalians often do a lot of their trading to the south and with Araby. So that's the Dogs of War. They're a bit of an interesting army. They were never one of the major ones, but hey, who doesn't love mercenaries? And oh boy, here we go, it's Greenskins. Now, following the success of Lord of the Rings, a movie that I am growing increasingly aware is quite old now, which kind of means that I'm getting old now. This is meant to be a fun segment. let's stick with the fun. I'm sure most people watching this know what an orc is. But in Warhammer Fantasy, they are a little bit different from standard fantasy fare. So let's engage in a little act of imagination. I mean, this is fantasy after all. First, I want you to imagine an army of creatures that are larger than man, stronger than full-grown men, and that live only to fight and are also supernaturally good at it. And in fact, that is the only love in their life. Basically, it's WWE in the 80s. Then I want you to imagine that they are fungi that emit spores. These shed from their skin as they rampage around and even when they're killed, and eventually those spores settle on the ground and grow into more of those creatures. These are the Greenskins, and it must be said that they are having a whale of a time. Seriously, they love their life as rampaging monsters. Indeed, the Greenskins are well known and not well loved for their warlust. And I'm specifically using the term warlust there, not bloodlust. And the reason for that is that bloodlust implies some sort of level of cruelty, but Greenskins don't believe themselves as cruel. It's not that Greenskins necessarily enjoy hurting others, although they probably do a little. It's more so that they just want to fight. There's an adorable simplicity to it, though take note that orcs are frequently voiced like they are football hooligans. Now, Greenskins come in 3 types. It's not just orcs. There's also goblins and squigs. Squigs are not green though. Orcs are the largest, most brutish, the strongest forces that comprise the backbone of a greenskin tribe. In contrast, goblins are small and cowardly, but they do possess a malicious cunning. And squigs could be described more like livestock than anything else. They are routinely hunted by their greenskin brethren for food, and larger squigs are used in combat, almost like a mount by goblins. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other types of greenskins as well. You get, for example, the black orcs that were created by the Chaos Dwarfs, as we talked about earlier. And there's also the night goblins as well, who are the sneakiest of goblins. They have made stealth and guerrilla fighting into an art form. And greenskins have often occupied as a really big threat to the world of Warhammer at large. Frequently, the Empire, for example, is invaded or rampaged along by greenskin forces. And in fact, it was the threat of greenskins that helped Sigmar unite the tribes that went on to become the Empire of Man. And it is also the threat of greenskins that has led to the historic alliance between Man and Dwarf. Basically, they can both agree that greenskins are pretty rubbish. And it was this alliance of Dwarf and Man that cast orcs out of the lands that now belong to the Empire. Temporarily. But even to this day, orcs mostly exist within a place of the world called the Badlands, especially around an area known myopically as the World's Edge Mountains. But even to this day, greenskins are nevertheless a huge threat to the civilized world. And that's not to say that orcs aren't civilized. I mean, perhaps to the Empire or Cathay, the orcs and greenskins are not that well organized, but they are organized. In fact, occasionally greenskins arrange themselves into these massive hordes. War parties that they call WAs. That is said with the capitals. And WAs are nuts. They are huge armies of greenskins, where the strongest, the scariest, the most frightening greenskins have risen all the way to the top. And these scariest greenskins end up becoming the de facto rulers of orcs. A great example of this is Grimgor Ironhide. He is the biggest black orc. And unlike many human or elf commanders, he will go to where the fighting is thickest in a battle. In fact, many orcs believe him to be utterly immortal. Him and the other black orcs that trudged out east. There's also a fun greenskin known as Azhag the Slaughterer. If you remember the great necromancer Nagash that we spoke about in the Vampire Count section, he had a magical artifact known as the Crown of Sorcery. And through some coincidences, it ended up in the hands of a petty orc war boss Azhag. Azhag put it on, and well, the results have been pretty explosive. Some of Nagash's soul, some of his powers were residual within the Crown of Sorcery, and now they have possessed Azhag. Kind of. Azhag still is firmly in control. You see, Greenskins may be relatively simple, but they've got a lot of willpower and they're pretty resolute. And this is why many of them can't be corrupted by chaos. They're not as weak-willed as men. They got fighting to do. You can take over their minds all you like. They think with their fists. And the result of this is that Azhag and his crown frequently argue with one another as to what to do next. I can actually think of no better hell for Nagash than to be arguing constantly with this orc. Though, thanks to the crown, Azhag does now command great magical powers. In fact, his magical ability is almost unrivaled in the entire world, except for perhaps by some of the greatest High Elven magisters. It's basically an orc with his hands on the nuclear button. And truly, there is a simplicity to the Greenskins that is very refreshing, honestly. Especially having just talked about the vampire counts. And this simplicity also finds its way into how Greenskins field their armies. Orcs make up the bulk of the Greenskin forces, although there's also goblins too who do fulfill the important job of dying, and also I guess being a minor distraction. You can tell that in Greenskin society, goblins are the subservient group to the orcs. Orc cavalry ride giant hogs and massive wolves. Even squigs in a pinch, basically anything they can get their hands on. Greenskins also deploy larger units. There is the Arachnos spider, which have been tamed by forest goblins. These are massive spiders that carries a bunch of goblins on its back who shoot their arrows at their opponents. That's a pretty terrifying sight, especially for the arachnophobes out there. And believe it or not, Greenskins have even mastered the use of artillery. Now, that's not to say they have rocket batteries or organ guns or cannons. No, they've got something much more ingenious. Allow me to introduce you to the Doom Diver, aka self-guided missiles. Raytheon got nothing on this one. This is a catapult that launches a goblin in a wingsuit high into the air, who then directs said salvo into the target that is to be hit, screaming all the way. They still haven't quite figured out how to get the goblin safely down. Still though, you can't argue with the results. And next up, I'm gonna briefly touch on Araby. Araby themselves aren't a distinct faction in Total War Warhammer, and in Warhammer Fantasy, they were never blessed with a full army battle tome. They have existed in supplements, and they have existed as part of the world and lore for the longest time though, so I think they deserve a little bit of a mention. So Araby is south of the Old World. It sits just west of Nehekara. Yes, that Nehekara, the ancient city of necromancers. And it is governed by the Sultan of all Araby. There is a wide dichotomy in Arabian society, mostly between that of the ultra-wealthy and the not so ultra-wealthy. I'm noticing a theme in all these human societies. I'm also noticing that it's not entirely unrealistic. The fabulously wealthy merchants are somewhat at the mercy of the hardened desert nomads. Because those are the guys that kind of get to make the decision as to whether or not the trade caravans are able to make it through the deserts. Maybe there's a lesson to be gleaned here. The cities of Araby are said to be some of the most beautiful in all of the world, and even have a bit of a nightlife, if that can be believed. Slavery also abounds, and religion isn't as mandated in Araby as perhaps some other places in the world. Some people choose to worship the jinn, although most people don't worship anything. And interestingly, while worship is tolerated in Araby, there are certain gods that have been banned. Notably, Cain, the elven god of murder, and Sigmar as well. Ooh, drama, drama, drama. The military might of Araby reflects the country itself. They are lavishly armed and well-armored soldiers. And they have the grit and determination that you can only get growing up in a desert. And some of the stranger units that they traditionally have fielded in battle are battalions of eunuchs, camel riders, and even sorcerers atop the flying carpets. Mighty elephants are also seen on the battlefield when Araby goes to war. And interestingly, magic in Araby is quite weak. The winds of magic spill from the north, from the frozen roof of the world, and Araby, being quite far south, doesn't have as easy access to the winds of magic. And as a result, most of the magic that stems from Araby comes from the Gene. These are demons bound to specific objects and locations. So it's a really interesting place, though it's a little bit underutilized, I think, in the setting of Warhammer. And now we come to the monstrous Beastmen. These creatures, the Beastmen, are why people do not go into the forests. The Beastmen are hideous aberrations, twisted abominations of man and animal, fused together by the baleful energies of chaos itself. They come in many forms, but uniformly they seek to ravage landscapes, despoil cities, and erect profane altars known as hearthstones to the dark gods of chaos. Ultimately, Beastmen detest civilization because it is something they can never know. They cannot create great works of art. They can only hate, they can only destroy. And they know that. And that's the worst part of all. The Beastmen were born at the same time as chaos itself, when a massive magical gate at the North Pole collapsed in on itself. And with the door knocked off its hinges, the energies of magic flowed freely into the world. And this warped the world at every level. And this is when the first Beastmen were born. And they themselves spread out into the world just as the energies of chaos did. They were a race that the young humans were powerless against. That is, of course, until Sigmar Heldenhammer united the tribes and cast the Beastmen into darkness. I think a word that describes Beastmen is resentment. They resent humanity. They live tortured lives. And much in the same way that there are many different animals that roam the land, sea, and air, so too are there many different types of Beastmen. The most numerous of these are the goat-like Gores and the larger Bestigors, because they're the best. There's also the weaker Ungors who are like bottom of the totem pole of beast folk. But above all of them are the Minotaurs, who tower over any other Beastman. And they are terrifying monsters, and if you've ever played Vermintide 2 and had one of these come at you, you know why. Cavalry-wise, Beastmen ride Tuskgors and Razorgors on chariots. Not to mention the Centaurs, who are a strange fusion of man and horse. And other various monsters join Beastmen as well. You have the one-eyed Cygors, who launch huge rocks across the battlefield. And there are Chaos Giants as well, who are drawn to these massive herds of Beastmen in search of food. There is also the Ancient Jabberslife, which is honestly a monster that simply defies description. It's a large thing with appendages. Speaking of large appendages, there's also the Gorgon. This is a cyclopean creature which can carve apart entire regiments with its massive blades. And though Beastmen aren't exactly the most organized group at all, they mostly keep to the dark forests, picking away at the edges of civilization. They have still had great leaders in their times. Perhaps one of the most famous is Khazrak One-Eye. This was a Beastman who was queerly intelligent, and he has come to rule the Drakeweld forest in Middenland. And actually, he came to prominence because he was able to strategically defeat an entire army that rode out from Middenland to defeat him and his herd. There is also a Beastman known as Morgor the Shadowgrave. This is an ancient Beastman whose very presence distorts the ground around him. It is said that wherever he goes, corruption follows, and worse still, each time he dies, he just seems to appear somewhere else. And if you can believe it, Morgor was said to have been born from a human mother. Grotesquely, he is meant to have torn himself from her womb and then killed the father when he attempted to kill it. Morgor then wandered the world for over 3,000 years. Until finally, it was tracked down by Lord Araloth of the Wood Elves, who incinerated it using sap from the Oak of Ages. This is the most secret and ancient tree to the Wood Elves. So Beastmen aren't exactly pushovers, and they have been known to terrorize the world for sure. They're one of my own personal favorites, and I have a little army of them myself, so don't discount them. And that is the old world. That is the majority of factions and peoples in the old world, though you might have noticed some were missing. most notably the Lizard Man, Skaven, and Elves. And that's because I'm going to cover them in my next video on every single Warhammer Fantasy faction here. And if you missed my previous one covering Cathay, Kislev, Ogres, and more, check it out here. And as always, a huge thanks to my patrons, especially Stephen Jackson, Sonic Bread, and Beauregard Quipman. And this content takes a lot of time to make, produce, and edit, so if you do want to help support the channel, check out patreon.com/discourseminiatures. It's only thanks to my patrons that this content is possible, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye!